Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a shocking mystery. James discovers a hidden room in his father's house filled with files secretly tracking Tu Diep's life for over 15 years. And an old photograph reveals that the two of them had already met as children, only for someone to erase that memory completely. What really happened that day? And why did James's father try so hard to keep them apart? Stay with us to uncover the truth. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The deeper James looked into Tu Diep's past, the more uneasy he began to feel. At first, he thought the strange behavior was only coming from himself, his growing curiosity, the questions that refused to leave his mind. But the more he paid attention to his father, the more something felt wrong. Mr. Huan seemed to know far too much about Tu Diep. Not just the obvious things, where she worked, where she lived now, but details that no ordinary person would casually know. Sometimes his father would mention something about her past in passing, then immediately change the subject, as if he had accidentally revealed more than he intended. It bothered James more than he wanted to admit. Why does he act like he's known her for years? James muttered one evening as he sat alone in his apartment. The thought lingered in his mind for days. Eventually, curiosity turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into action. One quiet night, James drove to his father's house. The large estate stood silent beneath the dim glow of garden lights, the kind of place that always felt too calm, too controlled. His father wasn't home. James had come here countless times growing up, but tonight the house felt different, almost like it was hiding something. He stepped inside, the polished floor echoing faintly beneath his shoes. The long hallway stretched ahead of him, lined with paintings and old family photographs. And that was when he noticed it again. At the far end of the hallway was a door that had always been locked. As a child, James had asked about it once. "Dad, what's inside that room?" His father had simply answered, "Storage, nothing important." But James remembered something clearly. He had never, not even once, seen that door open. Tonight, the silence of the house seemed to push him toward it. James walked slowly down the hallway until he stood in front of the door. He reached for the handle and turned it. Locked. Of course. He stared at the door for a moment, his mind racing. If there's nothing important inside, why keep it locked all these years? The question wouldn't let him walk away. James turned and headed toward his father's study. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. His father's desk sat exactly as always, organized, precise, almost intimidating. James opened the top drawer. Nothing unusual. The second drawer held documents and business papers, but the third drawer, inside it was a small ring of keys. James picked them up slowly. His heartbeat quickened as he returned to the hallway. Standing in front of the locked door again, he tried the first key. No luck. The second key. Still nothing. Then the third. Click. The sound echoed louder than it should have. James hesitated for a second before slowly pushing the door open. The moment the door swung inward, he froze. Inside the room were rows of tall metal filing cabinets. Not one or two. Dozens. The room looked less like a storage space and more like a private archive. "What is all this?" James whispered under his breath. He stepped inside. The cabinets were carefully labeled with dates and categories, everything arranged with the same meticulous precision his father applied to every aspect of his life. James approached the nearest cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were folders, each one sealed, dated, and cataloged. He picked up the first folder he saw. When he opened it, his breath caught. Printed across the cover was a name he knew too well, Tu Diep. James felt a sudden chill run down his spine. Slowly, he opened the folder. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some were taken from a distance, like surveillance images. Others looked like official photos taken from school records. In one picture, Tu Diep looked no older than 8, standing outside a small school building. Another photo showed her walking along a quiet street, holding a bag of groceries. There were documents as well: school enrollment records, addresses of places she had lived, lists of people she had interacted with, even copies of old identification forms. James flipped through the pages, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. This can't be real. The more he looked, the worse it became. Some of the photographs clearly showed that whoever took them had been observing her without her knowledge. Candid shots, moments captured from far away. It looked exactly like someone had been quietly following her life for years. James checked the date printed on one of the earliest documents. His eyes widened. 15 years ago. He checked another file. 14 years ago. Another. 13. James felt the room spin slightly. These records didn't start recently. They started when Tu Diep had still been a child. He slowly lowered the papers onto the table beside him. A terrifying thought began forming in his mind. My father, his voice barely came out as a whisper, has been watching her for her entire life. James stood motionless in the center of the room, trying to understand why. Why would his father secretly track the life of a girl who had nothing to do with their family? What was so important about Tu Diep? The question echoed in his mind as he continued searching through the cabinets. One drawer contained older folders, their edges slightly worn with time. James opened one of them. Inside was a single photograph. The colors had faded slightly, suggesting it had been taken many years ago. He brought it closer to the desk lamp. It was a photo from what looked like a charity event at an orphanage. Several adults stood in the front row, smiling politely for the camera. Among them, James immediately recognized a familiar face. His father. Mr. Hoan looked younger in the picture, his posture still confident, his expression calm. Standing beside him was a small boy. James leaned closer. That boy looked around 6 or 7 years old, short hair, a neat shirt, an awkward smile. James stared at the image. That's me. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. He had no memory of this event. But there was no doubt. That child was him. Then something else caught his attention. In the background of the photograph, slightly behind the group of adults and children, stood a small girl. She was partially hidden behind the others, almost as if she had stepped into the photo accidentally. Her long hair fell over her shoulders. She wore a simple dress. James moved the photo closer to the light. His heart began to pound. The girl's face was younger, softer, but there was something unmistakably familiar about it. He studied the eyes, the shape of her smile. Even at that age, he recognized her. Tu Diep. The name escaped his lips without him realizing. James felt his entire body go still. That meant one thing. He and Tu Diep had been in the same place, at the same time, years ago, as children. And yet neither of them remembered it. James slowly lowered the photo, staring at it as if it might change if he looked away. How is that possible? Then he turned the photograph over. On the back of it, written in small handwriting, was a short sentence. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. August 12th. Don't let the boy remember that girl. James felt a cold wave rush through his body because he recognized the handwriting instantly. It was his father's. James kept staring at the words as if they might disappear if he blinked. August 12th. Don't let the boy remember that girl. For a long moment, the room was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. The photo trembled slightly between his fingers. That's impossible, James murmured. He knew that handwriting better than anyone. Growing up, he had seen it on countless documents, birthday cards, even notes left on the kitchen counter. It was unmistakable. It belonged to his father. James slowly leaned back against the desk, trying to steady his breathing. The realization spreading through his mind was more disturbing than anything he had imagined before entering this room. His father had not only been secretly tracking Tu Diep's life, he had known about her since she was a child, and somehow He had made sure James forgot her. James ran a hand across his face. Why would he do that? He turned the photo over again, studying the image more carefully. The scene looked peaceful on the surface. Children gathered around volunteers, a small charity event meant to bring smiles to kids growing up without families. But now that he knew the truth, the photo felt different, staged, calculated, like a moment that someone had carefully arranged and later tried to erase. James suddenly noticed something else. Behind the group of children, near the entrance of the orphanage building, stood a tall man partially out of frame. His face wasn't clearly visible, but his posture looked familiar. James narrowed his eyes. He quickly returned to the cabinets and searched for more files connected to that date. After several minutes of digging through folders, he found another document, a printed schedule from the charity event. His father's name appeared at the top as the main sponsor, but there was another name listed beside it. James froze when he read it. Dr. Ly. The name felt strangely familiar. Then the memory hit him. Dr. Ly had been the family doctor when James was a child, a neurologist. James felt his stomach tighten. Why would a neurologist attend a charity event at an orphanage? He flipped through the folder again and found a second photograph taken that same day. This time the image showed the crowd from a different angle, and this time the tall man near the building entrance was clearly visible. Dr. Ly, James' heart began pounding harder. "Why were you there?" he whispered to the photo. A terrible possibility crept into his thoughts. He turned back to the first photograph and looked again at the handwritten note. "Don't let the boy remember that girl." Remember, the word echoed in his mind. James slowly sat down in the chair beside the desk. As far as he could recall, his childhood memories before the age of 8 were strangely blurred. He had always assumed that was normal. Many people couldn't remember much from early childhood. But now he wasn't so sure. What if they made me forget? The idea sounded absurd. Yet the presence of Dr. Ly in that photograph suddenly made everything feel less impossible. James grabbed another folder from the cabinet labeled 2008. Inside were medical records. Not Tu Diep's, his. James's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents. Neurological examinations, memory evaluations, appointments with Dr. Ly, all dated within a few weeks after the charity event. What the hell? James skimmed through the reports, trying to understand the technical language. One line caught his attention. Patient exhibits temporary memory suppression following neurological procedure. James felt his pulse racing. Procedure? What procedure? He turned to the next page. Memory loss affecting events occurring between August 10th and August 15th. James dropped the file onto the desk. Those dates matched the charity event. August 12th, the exact date written on the photograph. This can't be real, James whispered. His mind spun as pieces began connecting together in ways he couldn't ignore. His father had taken him to that orphanage. He had met Tu Diep there. Something had happened. And afterward, his memories had been erased. James stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. No, that doesn't make sense. Why would his father go to such extreme lengths? Why erase a child's memory of another child? What could possibly have happened that day? James stopped pacing when another thought struck him. If his memory had been erased, then maybe Tu Diep's had been too. He grabbed the photo again and studied her small face carefully. She looked shy in the picture, standing slightly apart from the other children, but there was something else in her expression. Recognition, as if she had been looking at him. James suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to see her. Right now. He shoved the files back into the cabinet and hurried out of the room, locking the door behind him just as he had found it. The drive across the city felt longer than usual. His mind replayed everything he had discovered again and again. The surveillance files, the photographs, the erased memories. By the time he reached Tu Diep's apartment building, his heart was pounding. He climbed the stairs quickly and knocked on her door. A moment later, the door opened. Tu Diep stood there, looking surprised. "James," she said softly, "what are you doing here this late?" For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He simply stared at her face, trying to see the little girl from the photograph. "James," she repeated. He finally spoke. "Tu Diep, have you ever been to the Sunrise Orphanage charity event when you were little?" She frowned slightly. "What?" "About 15 years ago," he said. "There was a charity event. My father was there." Tu Diep looked confused. "I grew up in that orphanage," she replied slowly. "There were lots of charity events." James stepped closer. "Do you remember meeting a boy there?" She shook her head immediately. "No." James hesitated before asking the next question. "Do you remember anything strange happening around that time?" Tu Diep crossed her arms thoughtfully. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then her expression changed slightly. "Actually," she murmured. James felt his chest tighten. "What?" She looked uncertain. "I've always had a strange gap in my memories from when I was about 7. James froze. "A gap?" She nodded slowly. "Just a few days. I remember everything before, and everything after. But those days in the middle," she shrugged, "they're just blank." James felt the air leave his lungs, the same dates, the same missing memories. And suddenly, the terrifying possibility became unavoidable. Someone had erased both of their memories. James looked at her with a mixture of shock and dread. "Tu Diep," he said quietly, "I think our past was stolen from us." James begins to suspect that his father, Mr. Hwan, knows far more about Tu Diep than he should. One night, while searching his father's house, James discovers a locked room filled with files secretly documenting Tu Diep's life. Photos from her childhood, school records, addresses, and even surveillance images. Shockingly, the documents date back more than 15 years, suggesting that Mr. Hwan has been monitoring her since she was a child. While searching through the files, James finds an old photograph from a charity event at the orphanage. In the picture, he sees his younger self standing beside his father, and behind them, a small girl who is unmistakably Tu Diep. Realizing they had met as children but remember nothing, James turns the photo over and finds a chilling note written by his father. "Don't let the boy remember that girl.